Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, 2008, New York Governor Eliot Spitzer resigned after reports that he had patronized a prostitution ring. Just about 2 years earlier, Spitzer had come into office pledging to clean up the notoriously corrupt and sketchy New York government, but he was quickly embroiled in a series of scandals. And then this absolutely wild week of news stories, starting on March 10th with the first reports in the New York Times and then the New York Post and elsewhere. The initial headline in the Post was Spitzer linked to prostitution ring. And then, as you can imagine, the New York Post headlines got pretty wild and pretty out there over the course of that week. Some of those headlines and images are still seared into my brain, and we'll recount them here. But let's talk about Eliot Spitzer's fall, but also a bit about his rise, because as I mentioned, he really did come in with a reputation as someone who was going to clean up Albany in lots of ways. And there is no better guest to have on for this than Azi Paybarah, now a political reporter at the Washington Post, but Azi has done stints at the New York Times, WNYC, where I got to know him, Politico, the New York Observer, one of the best chroniclers of New York governmental shadiness that we have. Azi, hello. Thanks for coming on the show. It's great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Apologies for taking you back to the spring of 2008, but,
there were more innocent times.
I know.
It is funny to think about how quaint the scandal is compared to what's happened since.
Well, we'll get into that in a sec after we get through the details of the scandal. But here to do that, as always, I should introduce Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So, yeah, we'll talk about the innocents. We'll talk about Spitzer himself. First off, I use the word embroiled in the intro, which I know is probably a cliche, but it's like if anyone was embroiled, it was Spitzer in March of 2008. And I know that I think for you, Azi, like this was relatively early in your career, was very early in my time sort of covering New York politics. I was at WNYC, but like had just started. And it feels like there's a whole generation of New York reporters who were kind of like grew up or thrown into the fire of this scandal. And I'm just curious, like, before we get into the details, can you just talk about like what it felt like to be like, this is my job now to cover this?
Oh, it was wild because we were dealing with a scandal and we had been accustomed to a certain level of increasing volume and vitriol in politics. And remember, like Roger Stone was like somewhere in the background of this thing before he became known for like what we know him now. And also the idea that like the internet and social media, like these were such early embryonic stages of all of that. In fact, one of the big takeaways from this entire saga that almost seems laughable now is that the New York Times decided to publish the story online first before putting it in print. And that itself was a big development because, you know, the way we think about the internet now and reading, you know, our, you know, stories on our phone, that wasn't as an accepted practice when this was happening. So to think about the news information system, to think about who these characters were, to think about what our level of care and concern was about things that we call scandals, like it was just very different, you know, 20 years later.
Did you sleep that week?
I was afraid to close my eyes because of all the images that were passing through me because of that to happen. But it was a lot happening. And also, I just want to say, it didn't end with Spitzer because the person that succeeded him had his scandals and shocking revelations. So this was the start of so many things.
Yeah. Do either of you have memories, Kellie and NIki?
I do. I mean, I was in New York, living in New York at this time. We were both in grad school.
Yeah, we were both living in New York, although, you know, I think I was so buried in research that it kind of played out in the periphery in my mind.
You know, it's funny. There were so many, I feel like, sex scandals. I confused Eliot Spitzer for
Anthony Weiner.
What is it? Anthony Weiner. I did. And I actually had to Google because I couldn't get his face in my head until I Googled him because all I thought of was Anthony Weiner. And I was like, it's too many sex scandals, too much stuff in the atmosphere.
Well, one was Client 9 and the other was Carlos Danger. And you know, it's hard to keep track. So look, before we get to the actual scandal and the Post headlines and all of that stuff and the media environment, which I'm glad you mentioned, Azi, can you just paint that sketch, Azi, of Spitzer as Sheriff of Wall Street, which I think a number of people have gotten that sort of moniker over the years, but he was considered that, the Sheriff of Wall Street. He comes into office, as I mentioned, with this real sense that he was like on the up and up and going to clean things up. Can you take us back to that version of Eliot Spitzer?
Yeah. Yeah. So Eliot Spitzer is a guy who ran and eventually won a position that not many people had cared a lot about, which was Attorney General of New York, right? So he gets this position, and one of his aides finds this like obscure law that allows him to start prosecuting what he perceives as financial crimes in Wall Street, and sort of energizes that office in a way that like very few people, if ever, have ever done before. And now he makes all these headlines. He is sort of, his critics would say he was bullying all these companies to either settle with him or face these unflattering headlines. He was like this gigantic force in Democratic politics. And the next thing he wanted to do was become governor. So the governor's position opens up. He runs for it. He wins in this like gigantic landslide. Like it was, people were just waiting for him to come into that office, clean up Albany. And, you know, his supporters were thinking the next stop for him is Washington, D.C. and the presidency. So this was a guy who was like a rising star, a meteor. There were so many people behind him that they overlooked what critics pointed out were his flaws, that he was, you know, hard to work with, hard charging, bending laws that he should be, you know, more deferential to, and that he had a gruff way of working with people. You know, this was a guy whose future was on like a fast track right to the top.
And this is very much a New York story, but he was right on the kind of zeitgeist in 2006, because remember in like 2005, 2006, there are all of these sex and corruption scandals that are breaking right before the election. There's the Page scandal. There's the Abramoff scandal. There are all of these prosecutions that are happening right in the run up to the election. And here you have this guy in New York who is coming in as a prosecutor, promising to clean things up. And he is like right where voters are as he is getting ready to take office in New York.
And he wins 70% of the vote. We will never get those numbers again. It's just it's remarkable.
So, as is often the case with scandals, right? There's something that like softens the ground, I would say, for a scandal, right? Or begins to show cracks. And in his case, in Spitzer's case, there was this scandal that I think everyone at the time was like, oh, this is the Spitzer scandal, and we'll cover this, right? And it was Troopergate, right? Which is a phrase, again, it's like one of these phrases that rings in the ears of reporters of the time, and no one else really remembers it much. But Troopergate was what? He was like, well, it involved escorts of another kind.
So if I remember correctly, Spitzer came into Albany with this idea of uncompromising bullying as his sort of legislative practice. And his rival in the legislature was the top Republican, a state senator by the name of Joe Bruno. And, you know, New York is a big state. And to get around, state leaders have often used not just cars and trains, but often helicopters to get from one place to another. And what Spitzer did, which became Troopergate, that pre-scandal, was he had tasked somebody with logging his political opponent's use of this public asset, this like basically the state helicopter. And that information was then provided to the Albany Times-Union, which is like the leading paper in Albany. And they came out with this like blockbuster story about how Joe Bruno is flying around the state using the helicopter for essentially political purposes. So Spitzer, in an attempt to soften his opponent, helps create this like scandal. So what does that person do? He turns around and goes, the troopers are spying on me. The people who are escorting me, the people who are my essential bodyguards, they were in cahoots with this spying. And he immediately flips the story that's negative on him about this new governor abusing his power and abusing authority. And Spitzer very quickly was on his heels explaining why he was actually not the bad guy in this story. It was remarkable.
Yeah.
I also think it's one of those situations where Spitzer's personality and perhaps personality flaws really play into this, because he was vindictive, and he was really ready to go for the jugular against his opponents, and so nobody wanted to stand by him when he's caught in this particular mini scandal.
Why is it that always, it's like a never fail evergreen story in which there's always the politician that's going into like clean up corruption, and they're the number one person that's like, it's the politician that's like big on family values while they're cheating on their wife. You know, there's always, it's like it comes around like a merry-go-round.
Well, I mean, one thing might be projection, right? That's a big part of it. Yes. But the other is, but I do also think like specifically this, like, I'm going to clean up corruption thing. There is a level of imperiousness at the heart of that. And a kind of like, I alone can fix it type thing. And just like, I'm going to go in and clean things up, and I'm going to use every tool I can at my disposal, which of course sometimes means I'm going to bend the rules for the greater good of trying to get my way. And so then you run into trouble. I think Spitzer was a huge combination of all those things. I don't think misusing a helicopter was the number one sort of corruption in Albany that needed to be cleaned up. So I think this was definitely a sign of,
Only.
And the other thing about that put him on the defensive was he was the outsider to Albany, and that there were Democrats who were working with the Republicans. There was the person who replaced him as Attorney General, Andrew Cuomo. He didn't want Spitzer to stay there all that long or be successful. Cuomo wanted to replace him, and Cuomo did this really damaging report about Troopergate that basically criticized Spitzer.
So that's a big part of what happens when this prostitution ring scandal breaks, is that he has no friends, right? So, but let's talk a little bit about how that actually breaks. The interesting thing about kind of how the information that leads to them then discovering that Spitzer had been getting high-priced escorts for years, including when he was Attorney General, is through bank transactions, right? So North Fork Bank, which is his bank, starts to flag a bunch of big transactions, in part because they think that maybe, there's like real corruption going on here. Is he taking bribes? Is he involved in terrorism or something? Because we're talking, tens and tens of thousands of dollars floating back and forth without a real sort of accounting for what's up, right?
Like whenever anybody moves large amounts of money around, it like generates a kind of like a flag or paper trail, and regulators go like, well, where's this going? Are you buying a house? Are you relocating, or are you paying someone in a brown paper bag for something that they shouldn't be doing? And that puts him on the radar of investigators, which is really surprising since he was so intimately familiar with these types of transactions and behaviors.
Yeah.
If only he had sent $9,999, like that little $10,000 threshold just did him in.
It's true.
If only they had Venmo back
That's
then.
right. He could have just put something innocuous in the little memo, and it would have been fine.
Right. Or Bitcoin, which was basically invented to hide these kinds of transactions.
Well, it doesn't help that, the transfers, when they're tracing their transfers, like where they're coming from, they're going to a place called the Emperor's Club, or the transfers are made from a place called the Emperor's Club, which, the name alone. That name alone sounds suspicious. And that's kind of what leads to the downfall, right? The fact that they trace it back to this escort service.
Yeah, and it's a particular one that I believe he himself had prosecuted.
Is that how he came to know about it? Like, was he, this is how he was like introduced to the world of high price escorts, and he was like, this one's kind of nice.
The irony abounds in the Spitzer story. He's a guy who brushed off criticism when as Attorney General, he prosecuted people for doing what he later did himself. And it's just fascinating that happens, and it gets wrapped up in this idea that he not only, was participating in something that was illegal, but it was with consenting adults, right? Like if you put that part aside, it's the irony that he was caught doing something he himself had prosecuted others for. And it very quickly got wrapped up in the idea that one of the places where he was known to have used these services was Washington, D.C., when he was there as governor to testify at Congress for a hearing where nobody invited him, that he himself created the environment using government resources as arguably a guise for this liaison. And it's the idea that he didn't just do this in his private life, but that he wrapped up and used instruments of government to create the situation to allow this.
Yeah. Wow. Almost like using a government helicopter in order to go to campaign events.
Irony. Yes, exactly.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
I think eventually there was another story about how he had a fundraiser and then had arranged a liaison around the fundraiser. And the fundraiser got canceled, but he still went had his tryst. And so yes, there were all these details and this hypocrisy and this irony and all that stuff. Some of the other sort of specifics of what eventually comes out. So the FBI and the IRS are now talking to each other and saying, hey, let's what's going on with these transactions. He goes under surveillance, and so there's wiretaps, and eventually it gets revealed that he had been. I mean, again, this was going back for years, but somewhere in 2008, as the wiretaps were going up, he'd paid more than $15,000 for at least, over the course of 6 months, for at least 7 liaisons with prostitutes from the Emperor's Club while he was under surveillance. There is also an element here, Ozzy, you mentioned it, of Roger Stone sticking his nose in all of this. And so at some point, I think it was the fall of 2007, supposedly Stone sent a letter to the FBI saying Spitzer's up to some stuff. Do you have any sense of how Stone plays into this story and why he may have been actually one of the first ones to tip people off?
So Roger Stone is a person who is a political operative who embraces the persona of like a dirty trickster. He often exaggerates, but has some legitimate role in so many major stories that happen. He was working with Senator Joe Bruno, the person who was on the receiving end of the Troopergate scandal for a while. He has a long time association with Donald Trump, whose, activities, shady and otherwise, put him into contact or in proximity to lots of information that ranges from conspiratorial to actual ahead of the curve. So I don't quite know when exactly Roger Stone became aware of information, but I do know that after this bursts open, he goes around claiming credit for certain details about this, including the fact, which I don't think actually bears out, but that Roger Stone made popular, the idea that during his tryst that Eliot Spitzer wore his socks, which is an image
black calf length socks.
That image sticks.
I was trying to avoid that image, but yes, you are absolutely correct. And he reveals this, I believe, talk about layers of hilarity. I believe he reveals this to a New Yorker writer while he's being interviewed, I believe, at a sex club in Florida.
A lot happening.
And the thing is, Roger Stone is a person who has a history with sex scandals and feels like he was unfairly banished from the establishment and has this kind of edge about him. And then Roger Stone then becomes a political operative who helps promote the candidacy of a woman who claims that she was the madam behind all of this. And again, it turned out not to be true, but this is a person who projects that storyline. And what happens is the Spitzer scandal happens, and then the ripple just sort of lives on with people who are motivated to use the attention-grabbing nature of it. And Roger Stone is sort of like a master at that.
Yeah. And Kellie, the sock thing, that's one of the things I definitely remember from all of this.
Yep.
And, the Post had a headline that was like a mock-up of Spitzer wearing just boxers and then high socks. But again, it's like the sticky details in all of this, and obviously the salaciousness is a huge part of this. The memories are flooding back for Ozzy. I can see it.
Sorry. I just wanted to double check this. The person Roger Stone sort of said this thing about the socks. was New Yorker writer Jeffrey Toobin,
Oh,
Oh my gosh.
who
Oh my
himself.
gosh.
So I mean, you can Google that one.
Yeah. Wow.
Wow.
Wow. Yeah.
This is just
Embroiled.
wild.
We are all embroiled.
I mean, you throw Andrew Cuomo in there and Roger Stone and Donald Trump, and suddenly you're like, oh, there's a type.
No hands
Yeah.
are clean. Everyone's dirty up in this. And it's just, it's a lot.
Men behaving badly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, the Post, obviously, I'm just looking at some of the headlines, but it's like
Oh.
Spitz eating grin and sleazy does it and, rough socks.
Nope.
But even sites like Gothamist, which was an early blog in those days and is now part of WMIC, but, their headline was Spitzer reportedly a socks on John, So, I mean, it's just sitting right there for the media, and I want to come back to your point, Azi, of like this being this crossover moment where you have early internet, but then clearly tabloids like the Post. Like I have this whole theory about the Jeremy Lin stuff, which was a few years later, and obviously was a big thing. But I also see that as like that was at this perfect crossover where like tabloids, actual newspapers, blogs, internet, cable TV all still had power. All had, some were declining, some were increasing, but they were all very powerful. And so the media was just saturated. And I think that's a big part of this story as well.
Yeah, and it's incredible because there was a visual component to this story, and it later gets superseded by like the Anthony Weiner scandal.
Yeah.
But it is different in some respects than like arguably the most famous scandal before that, which was like the Bill Clinton scandal, right? Like you had Bill Clinton saying on video, "I did not have relations with that woman," referring to Monica Lewinsky, the White House intern at the time. And you sort of had that was a much more like text-based kind of story, people saying stuff back and forth, and people and gatekeepers at the time still being able to like show a level of restraint. With the Spitzer scandal, you had like the New York Post putting one of the women, Ashley Dupree, on the cover and later hiring her as like a columnist for a brief period of time at the paper. You had her on the front page. You had Spitzer standing up, admitting he had done wrong in one press conference, then coming back to like resign. You had like the slow moving image of his car being driven into the office to like explain what was going on. It was more visual in a way than I think had preceded it.
Yeah.
But it happens in New York, and it's all these characters that are just larger than life.
And I feel like the guardrails around sex scandals had been lowered so much after the Starr report and the Clinton scandal. And it's, it's not just Gothamist, but you have Gawker at that time. And they are sites that just don't have any sort of like shared set of boundaries, particularly for the more lascivious scandals. And so you get just like blanketed day after day with not just coverage, but like very explicit, jokey, over-the-top coverage that sears it into cultural memory.
I mean, the New York Post front page, the day that the day after it broke. Do you remember what it was? Ho no.
Oh boy.
My God.
I mean, and they had this on the front page for I think like 4 or 5 days in a row.
Yeah. Well,
Wow.
So I want to, as we start to wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about kind of how it broke, why it broke the way it did, how quickly it happened, and then some of the legacy stuff. But, we're talking about 7 days here, right? It's just a frenzy between that first report, which was in the Times, the New York Times, and then the Post really driving the nail into the coffin 7 days later. Do you remember, Azi, a sense of like, was it right off the bat kind of like, oh, this is going to sink him? Or was there a moment, or, did it evolve? Because that's fast.
Yeah, it was fast. So the Times publishes their story online. The governor cancels his events. I was sitting in a room and a reporter from another outlet said, "Hey, there's something going on. There's something weird. He's canceling all his events." And then they announced that he's going to do like a press conference at his Midtown office. He read a very brief statement, and his wife is standing next to him, and they were just like grief-stricken. Like she looks like somebody has died, and she's at a funeral, and it's very understandable that kind of reaction. And Spitzer like reads a brief statement, acknowledges some shortcomings, and then leaves. And I believe it's at that press conference where somebody yells out, like a New York Post columnist, I think, yells out, "Silda, are you going to leave him?" right? There's questions about whether or not New York will have the same person as governor, and yet there's this like emotional human element happening, and it's all happening at the same time. There were Democratic operatives and people I was speaking to at the time who were basically saying, this guy's toast. The lieutenant governor at the time, David Patterson, he's getting ready. Now, some of that was perhaps more wishful thinking than anything, but there clearly was a sense that he wanted to stay and that the enemies he made along the way wanted him to go. And those enemies included Republicans and Democrats. And he stepped aside. Now, he did try to run again for a city comptroller office years later. And what's amazing is that he did so at the same time that Anthony Weiner, who left Congress, because of a different scandal of a different nature. And New York Magazine did this amazing thing where they showed on the front cover half of both of their faces, like sort of next to each other.
Oh.
And it's an amazing image because it spoke to this moment where, at least in New York, people were wrestling with the idea of the differences in their scandals and who was perhaps more wrong and what should we make of this, which eventually also drew in questions about the Bill Clinton scandal and revisiting all of those at a time when people are also questioning, how we cover things, what should be legal, what should not be legal, what we do to people who are victims of certain crimes. These scandals have a way of producing dialogues. But one of the things that projected them forward for so many years was the unwillingness to let that be the last thing that these two men wanted to have known about their careers, Eliot Spitzer and Anthony Weiner. They wanted to continue public life well after their admitted wrongdoing.
So interesting to think about that in the years leading up to the Me Too movement and the kind of traction it takes and the kind of traction it doesn't get and the way that it begins to soften the ground. But you don't yet have that big uprising that you would have, some 3 or 4 years after their ill-fated attempts to regain office.
There was also something kind of amazing that happened after Spitzer resigned and he was out of the public spotlight. Alex Gibney, the documentary maker, did a whole thing about Client 9, and he interviewed Spitzer, and in it, Spitzer says something to the effect of, like why did you do what you do and everything? And he said something like he did this in part because it was something to the effect of, well, if I had an affair, I would have lost my marriage. But if I did this, like the downfall would have been I lose my career. And he somehow differentiated like having a liaison with someone
that's non-emotional.
That's not emotional. That like by doing it as a sort of a business transaction, right?
Oh, wow.
Like somehow the marriage would have been survivable even if his career hadn't been. But if it had been an affair with someone where he was emotionally invested, that the reverse might have been true. And he sort of makes this distinction, whether or not it's true, like he articulates it in this documentary, which I found fascinating. And it turned out not to be true. His wife eventually does part ways with him. But it gives you an insight into how this person tried to view or tries to justify,
rationalize
what
his behavior. Wow. That's wild to me because I feel like prostitute or lover, you're getting left. It does not matter to women.
and the other thing about that documentary that people have tried to articulate about Spitzer is that the enemies he made on Wall Street, the enemies he made legislatively, the big, powerful, very rich people, the Alex Gibney documentary makes the argument that Spitzer, for whatever his wrongdoings, they were minor compared to the punishment he received. And it was his powerful, rich enemies who used that to get rid of him so they can continue doing what they did. That's the argument of the Gibney documentary. And so it's hard to tell the story of Spitzer's sex scandal without talking about Spitzer, the guy who tried to clean up Wall Street, who tried to clean up elements of Albany.
We haven't done Anthony Weiner on this show, but certainly that has parallels to Anthony Weiner as well, right? And I think, part of this is I mean, look, these men all made terrible decisions and behaved in awful ways, but part of this is also like for a lot of Democrats, these folks were people who were really they had invested a lot of hope in their ability to affect some actual change on some real issues. And then, time and time again, these people tend to screw up, so to speak, in really serious ways. All right. Well, Azi, this has been a delight. It's been very fun to have you on. Really interesting to relive this. And I suppose we could just proclaim now that this is the first in a multi-part series of successive New York governor scandals, right? Because every single governor after that, since then, ends up resigning or withdrawing in scandal. And maybe by the time we get through Patterson and Cuomo, Hochul will have landed in her own scandal, and we could just keep it going and going and going.
Not to make this a never-ending podcast, but one of the things that happened was when Spitzer left, his lieutenant governor got elevated to governor, and at his first news conference in the Red Room, which is where they have press conferences, that governor, David Patterson, called on a reporter, Jacob Gershman, and Gershman says, "Governor, just so we don't go through all of this again, let me just ask you, have you ever patronized a prostitute?" And it's like an amazing question. And I forget if I was there or not, but I remember watching. I was like, what's going on? And Patterson goes, "Only lobbyists." and the entire room bursts out laughing. And there was this cathartic moment that the worst was behind us in New York. And clearly that was not true. But
that was not true.
But there was an amazing moment where like Spitzer was apparently in the rearview mirror with his troubles.
Well, I think we should do Patterson, and I do think actually, for better and then eventually for worse, he was very quick and funny, and that sometimes got him in trouble, and sometimes it helped him in moments like the one you just described. But anyway, Azi Paybarah, now of the Washington Post, thank you so much for doing this. This was really fun.
Thank you for letting me hijack this into a New York podcast scandal.
I love it. I love it.
Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Over the course of my public life, I have insisted, I believe correctly, that people, regardless of their position or power, take responsibility for their conduct. I can and will ask no less of myself.
Thanks for listening. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Our transcripts, which you can find on our website, are done by Kala Nakua. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, creator-owned, listener-supported podcasts. Audrey Mardovich, executive producer, Yuri Lasordo, director of operations. Thanks to all of you who support this show by being members of Radiotopia. Find transcripts, sign up for our newsletter, find us on social, suggest topics, all that and more at our website, thisdaypod.com. See you soon.
Radiotopia. From